Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Implement Test Traceability for Agile Development Teams. My name is Mark Lambert. I'm the VP of Products at Parasoft, and I'll be presenting today. Before we jump into the webinar, just a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, this is Zoom webinar, so if you've got questions, please fill them into the Q&A box. We'll be looking at the questions at the end of the session, so please just type them in as they pop into your mind. We'll do some triaging. We have a team online who's also reviewing questions and chat channel as those things come in. Now, just to make sure everybody's able to see my screen correctly, which says Zoom user tips, and that you're able to hear me, could you go ahead and just raise your hand? So you should be able to find a raise hand button. That'll also give me the opportunity to see if I can actually see the right screen. There we go. Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Let me also bring up the chat here as well so that I can actually monitor the chat as we're going through. Great. Thank you. Go ahead and put your hands down. And so as I said, the Q&A is open. So yes, if you post a question in there, we're going to see it. So I appreciate that question right there. Okay, so let's kind of jump into things. So today, as I said, we're going to talk about traceability and how that applies to Agile teams. Before we jump into the nuts and bolts of traceability, though, let's kind of set ourselves up a little bit as to why we're doing this thing. So obviously, everybody today is talking about Agile. All of the market surveys tell us that almost everybody's doing it at some level, whether it's an Agile with a big A or an Agile with a little a. One of the things that Agile really gives us the ability to do is to really focus on our customers and focus on getting quick feedback on the functionality that we're implementing. So these rapid iterations, getting it in the hands of our users or our stakeholders, it might not be ultimately our end user, but it might be the product owner or somebody else with some internal stakeholder that's reviewing the functionality, making sure that we're building the right thing in alignment with the business goals. The challenge is, though, that Agile does have a dirty little secret, and that's that it does introduce overhead. Not a lot, but you can imagine that each sprint, each meeting, each stand-up, all of these things compound. Now, you would argue that the benefits outweigh those costs, which I do firmly believe. But what we do tend to find is that many organizations are struggling to actually get the release velocity that they desire. This is where DevOps comes in. This is the other side of the equation. The automation of the delivery, whether that delivery is internally or even if it's potentially deployment straight out to the user, streamlining that process, doing everything as automated as possible. When you do that, you're able to really realize the benefits of Agile and the goal of Agile, which is to get that feedback. So the sooner you can get it out, the sooner you can get feedback. And when you do that, you get feedback on the quality process, and it actually somewhat forces you to build in automation into your testing process, because without automation, Agile doesn't scale. You can't keep up with the delivery if you are doing manual testing. We'll talk about different test automation strategies in a few moments. You can't keep up with the delivery if you've got one guy whose job it is to create the build and then put it on the servers and manually configure the connection files. It all has to be automated. And this is actually one of the key things that stops you from scaling Agile within an individual group. But then you have to also think about how you scale Agile across the organization. How do I get teams to work together towards a unified goal? It's very rare that you have one development team delivering an entire application. Usually an application of end functionality is a composite of multiple teams collaborating and working together. And within large enterprise organizations, this becomes very difficult to coordinate. This is actually where the Scaled Agile Framework, or SAFe, comes in. We at Parasoft partner with a number of SAFe experts. One of those would be Icon Agility, in the US. CollabNet version 1 is one of our technology partners. We'll actually be showing a little bit of the version 1 product today, as well as there are other vendors in the space which can really help you analyze how you're doing today from the point of view of implementing Agile and help guide you through the process of progressing to, if you like, the next level. The way that that is done is through the use of the DevOps Health Radar. In essence, what we have is a radar, which in essence becomes like a spidergram, several key elements that you're going to score yourself between 1 and 5. And then this is going to give you areas for improvement, as well as potentially, identifying potential weaknesses within your Agile process. Now, when we look at the radar, there are a lot of different components within it. Certainly when I saw this for the first time, I was a little bit shocked at the amount of text that's here. And we're not going to go through all of those different pieces because they're all very prevalent or important, should I say, when you're looking at your Agile process. But today, what we're going to be focused on today is how we can build quality into that software development process. And we're going to be focusing on these key sectors of the radar. So let's kind of pick apart those key sectors and talk about how we can build quality into our Agile testing process so we can deliver faster. And then we're going to talk about what role traceability plays in that. Now, notice the title of this slide. Continuous testing is a terminology used within the test automation industry right now to refer to tests that can run all the time. Running both sometimes in a production environment as well, running as part of integrated into your CI/CD pipeline, not tests that you have to wait for an environment to be ready, tests that are decoupled from the environment using something like service virtualization and executing those tests continuously. And we're going to talk about that today. That's certainly an area where Parasoft focuses and where our functional testing products really can help organizations shine. But testing is not the solution. You want to build quality into your process as a whole. You can't test quality into an application. So I'm going to talk about the different techniques that we can use, and I'm going to talk about how we tie that into building traceability into our pipeline. Now, if I break down the radar, I can break it down into a series of practices within the different phases. So within the develop and build phases, this is where code analysis can help us. I'm not talking about just kind of static code analysis with open source or something like a Sonar Cube. I'm talking about things which can uncover deep reliability and security issues, and I'll dig into those in a few moments. This is also where we can start applying TDD or potentially even BDD practices during the early phases, doing upfront work to make sure that what we're building is built right from the start by thinking about testability from the start. And then obviously the first phase of testing that can be done as part of a development pipeline would be that of unit testing. Then as we move further down the process and we start getting into testing end-to-end functionality of the application, we'll talk about testing at the UI, obviously, but also testing at the API, those things that sit behind your web interface, those RESTful services, the things that actually contain the business logic. They can be tested independently of the UI. And if you break them apart, it really gives you the ability to have a very scalable testing practice, and we'll talk about that. Load and performance testing is not just your functional requirements, it's your non-functional requirements, which also includes security, obviously, as well. We're not going to go into this in great detail today. There will actually be another webinar coming in the May timeframe where we'll talk about how we can optimize the performance testing process. As well as other webinars that we're going to do around going to UI testing in detail. But we'll talk about UI testing and API testing in more detail today as we talk through the process. We then want to be able to do those same practices once we've gone through our stage and potentially even our deployment phases of the radar. It's very important to test in production. I'm not telling you to do all your testing in production, but you want to do some verification in production. There is a terminology today called shift right testing. I think we've shifted as far left as we can in many cases, and we'll talk about that as well. But when you're talking about shift right testing, you have to be a little careful here. This is the testing in production, it's your canary testing, it's your blue-green testing. It is a great safety net to make sure that you've caught everything. It's also a great way of finding things that you have really not thought about as part of your test automation process. It is not a substitution. Don't think that your testing in production, your shift right, your canary testing means you don't have to test as part of your CI/CD pipeline, because basically that means you are not building quality in the application. What you're doing is you're building defects in, because they get out and you're going to have to go through the rollback process. So it's very valuable to have those verification tests in place, but you don't want to be using them as the gate. You want to be using them kind of as a safety net. So why is traceability important for Agile development teams? Well, the first reason why traceability is important is actually regardless of whether or not you're doing Agile development or waterfall-ish or big waterfall or what have you, if you're in a safety critical industry. So automotive, healthcare, medical devices, industrial IoT, functional safety, railway, all of these industries require that you have traceability to ensure that the functionality that's delivered is safe and secure. Connected devices now, connected cars, all of those great things means that there's a much bigger security issue within connected devices. Now, this is important because those traditional markets are also taking, or those traditional waterfall markets are taking advantage of Agile development practices in the same way that organizations within financial, healthcare, insurance, e-commerce, and so on are. So the next thing, though, is as I start moving into my Agile practice, specifically, what do I need to be able to improve my Agile practice? Well, the first thing I need is I need feedback. It's not just feedback from your stakeholders. It's not just feedback from the customers. It's feedback within your development sprint. I cannot wait until the end of the sprint before I test. Now, you are going to have to wait a little bit on some things because the development team aren't going to be finished, but you want to be doing it as tightly coupled as possible. You also don't want to wait on doing your regression testing until the end of the release. You want to be doing the regression testing constantly as you're going from sprint to sprint, and we need to be able to identify potential regressions sooner. Otherwise, what you're going to end up finding is you're end up finding those defects leaking into production, as I said. So what that means is I need to actually focus my testing because I don't think anybody on this call could look at their regression suite and go, yeah, I can run that in a sprint. Certainly we at Parasoft, I know that our regression suite is very, very comprehensive. So as we come to release, we need to make sure all of the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed. But what we also want to be able to do is to say, what of those regression tests can I execute earlier in my process? And traceability and integrations within the underlying code base that we'll talk about today as well gives me that insight so that I can optimize and prioritize and focus my quality practices. And the last thing, the challenge is, though, that the traditional test management solutions, such as the quality centers, the IBM Rationals of the world, these things don't really work very well for Agile development teams. As part of this webinar today, we ran a survey to see what technologies people were using, and no surprise at all, Jira was the #1 Agile planning infrastructure. And we'll talk about those different types of systems in a few slides. But the goal here is, okay, how can I support an Agile development practice with a test management solution? And there are ways of doing this with newer technologies that are available, and we'll talk about those in the market, and we'll kind of survey the audience a little bit through the chat channel as well. Okay, so the key that I hope we're seeing here is that testing, while it's not, you can't test quality into the application, testing is critical to ensure that we have a highly automated software development process and a highly automated quality assurance process. So how that is structured is we typically want to align towards something that's referred to as the testing pyramid. This is well known within agile development teams. For those that have not seen it before, this is a proposal up by Martin Fowler and Michael Cohn. They're two people that really evangelize around this concept, as well as almost everybody else in the testing industry as well. Certainly it's something that I believe strongly in. Basically, it says when you have a series of tests, what you want to do is you want to focus on having a strong foundation of unit tests. So basically do a lot of that, and then optimize and focus your manual testing efforts. Don't do a lot of manual testing. Your manual testing, though, is critically important. It's expensive and it's valuable. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to spend time doing mind-numbing regressions manually. You want to automate those, and you want to automate them at the most effective way possible. And really, the further down the pyramid you go, the more reliable those tests are, the easier they are to automate, although they do come with some challenges, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, one thing that testing pyramid does not address is the code that it's built on top of. This is how we can build quality into the application, making sure that the code, through the use of advanced code analysis, is reliable and secure. And we'll talk about the specifics of that in a moment. Okay, so as I mentioned, we actually ran a couple of questions before the webinar. So the first question, which was around how much automation have you achieved today, is kind of rather sobering when we think about the fact that test automation has been in the industry for decades. Still, we can clearly see that, in this case, actually only 12% of the audience today have high or maybe potentially sufficient levels of test automation. We have about 30% with nothing, and about 35% started but not got very far yet, with about another 25% somewhere in the middle. So, and this, to be honest, this pie chart doesn't change too much. I run this survey frequently during webinars to try and get a feeling for kind of where the industry is. And usually that high level of test automation ends up between 15 and 20%. So actually today's audience, I think really, what we hopefully can do today is give you some pointers as to how you can really get that level of automated testing further up, so you can really do efficient traceability. Now, we're going to run a quick poll, and we are going to run this very quickly. So if you are doing test automation today, can you select the types of test automation that you're doing? Now, if you're not doing any test automation at all, just say none, it's all manual, okay? So go ahead and fill that in, and then I'll watch to see where we are. The interesting thing here is to see kind of our audience today, what the breakdown of the different types of testing are. And then we'll talk about what I typically see. Okay, so I think, okay, are we able to close out the poll? Okay, we were having problems with the polling the other day, so I don't know if this is running right now. Okay, let's go ahead. There you go, fantastic, it popped up, great. Okay, so none, it's all manual at about 30%. Okay, it's a little, I'd say it's a little high for kind of typically the market, but don't feel bad. We can help you with that. UI testing is the highest at about 60%, which is what I would expect. API testing, that's actually pretty good at 40%. And then unit testing at 26%. Now, that also could be, the unit testing could actually be a side effect of the audience today. Typically, we find most organizations, unit testing sits as a responsibility with the development team, and unit testing often manual testing and UI testing with QA or test roles. Okay, so it's actually pretty consistent though with what we see normally. We normally see an inverted pyramid, right? So as we saw today, a lot of folks saying that they're doing just manual testing. Even those folks which are doing automated testing of other types, you're probably recognizing that you're not automating everything. And we typically find that this is because simply UIs are intuitive, right? And it's easy to just click around a UI quickly, get a feel for if it's working, and then just say, yep, it's tested, let's move on. The challenge though, as I said, is that humans are actually really bad at repetitive tasks. We're really good at kind of thinking tasks and creativity, which is why exploratory testing and testing manually around user stories is very valuable. But machines are really good at that. So what we want to do is we want to focus on doing automation. The challenge is the further down the pyramid we go, the harder it is to actually figure out how to do it. So the more technical you need to be, the harder it is to construct the tests. It's much quicker to execute them, and the test environment is much simpler, and it's actually easier for a developer or a test automation engineer to identify where the problem is. But that technical barrier increases pretty significantly. So what we want to do is we want to look at how we can start to automate some of these processes, and then how we can tie these automations to the work items which we're working on. So we're going to talk through that process. Now we're going to start by talking about the work item management. So typically the first place that you're going to start is you're going to write your user stories or your requirements. You're going to break those down into tasks. There might be issues or defects in your back-end system. And typically you're using one of these kind of systems. Now, if you're not using one of these, please just throw into the chat channel so that we can pick up on what other systems you're using. So we did, as I said, we did a survey before the webinar, and certainly the majority of folks were using Jira with some of the plugins for Jira. And we'll talk about Jira at the end of the webinar as to why with Jira you need these plugins. But then you see here there are a whole bunch of other systems as well. So Jira is certainly the most important when it comes, or should I say the most used when it comes to agile development practices. Now, we're going to have these work items implemented in our initial agile planning system, or enterprise agile planning system if we're talking about scaling. And this is what starts our delivery pipeline with each of our phases introduced as we go through. So let's break down how we can do these individual pieces and what it takes. So talking about code analysis. When you're looking at code analysis, what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to try and leverage industry best practices to prevent reliability issues and prevent security vulnerabilities. We're not talking about code beautification at this point. Now, that is a very valuable thing to do to promote maintainability of the code base, but frankly, there's a whole raft of different technologies out there for doing that. What I'm really focused on here is how can I make sure that I can apply the industry best practices which can help me avoid things like race conditions, overflows. How can I avoid security vulnerabilities by leveraging some of these industry best practices? When we're talking about security, which is typically what we're talking about within enterprise organizations like banks, healthcare, e-commerce and retail, you're typically looking at OWASP, CWE, or CERT. These are secure coding guidelines. OWASP and CWE are the two most relevant, the two most prevalent ones. These are focused on weaknesses, so vulnerabilities and weaknesses that you need to prevent in your application. CERT is more of an engineering standard. These are the things you shouldn't do from a code perspective. CERT is very good for C and C++ applications. It's a little limited when it comes to Java, that the CERT standard needs updating for Java. And certainly when we're talking about .NET, there actually isn't a CERT standard for .NET at this point. So when you're talking about Java development, you're going to be focused on OWASP and CWE probably. When you're focused on C or C++ development, you're going to be focused on CERT from the point of view of security. When we talk about reliability, and I'm talking about embedded devices here, typically you're going to be focused on AutoSAR for C++ or MISRA C for C. There are some industry best practices around Java and .NET. They aren't as highly publicized to a certain extent. There are practices around efficient Java practices and what have you. But a lot of that is actually focused around security when you're talking about Java development processes. Now, our goal here is to not only detect issues, and in fact, I would argue that really what we're trying to do here is prevent issues. So this graph here on the right-hand side, originally it's from Capper-Jones. Capper-Jones did some research in 1996 that basically came up with saying, look, we're finding the defects late in our cycle where it costs a lot more, but they're introduced when we do coding. So you'd think that given that this was in 1996, that the problem would have been addressed by now and that Agile has solved all of this. The short answer to that question is nope. In 2017, the research was redone, and unfortunately, we are still in the same state in 2017 as we were in 1996. It's just that we are doing it a lot more frequently. Now, what we want to do, though, through the use of code analysis here, is we're trying to do two things. We're trying to shift left the detection of defects, and actually all of the testing practices we're going to talk about today help with that. But the thing about coding standards and applying of these industry best practices means that we can really push down the number of defects that are introduced in the first place. This, for me, is the fundamental step to build quality into the application from the start. Now, once I've got a solid code base, I now need to think about, okay, doing some verification of that code and making sure that the code is executed correctly. And then this is where I start thinking about my acceptance tests against those defined stories. Now, I have a decision to make here. Now, firstly, actually, I should point out, the reason this box has got dashed lines around it is this is kind of an optional step. I mean, it's not really an optional step. You should be defining your acceptance criteria as you're defining your user stories. But based upon conversations with many organizations, what we see is we do see that many times somebody will define the user story and the requirement, but not actually define how they're going to test it. So you're doing your testing kind of directly of the story. I do believe strongly that defining your acceptance test up front makes your testing job a lot easier, especially from a test automation perspective, because what you're doing is you're thinking about testing from the beginning. So it actually, you naturally are going to build more testable code. And actually, this is also true when you actually apply unit testing at the earlier stages in the process. You're going to start building more testable code from the start. But as I said, we've got a decision to make here. And my decision is, am I going to do manual tests or am I going to do automated tests? And when I come to do my automated tests, am I going to do unit testing, leveraging frameworks like JUnit for Java or NUnit, VS-Test, MS-Test for .NET? There really isn't a universally good one unit testing framework for C and C++. There are a few like CPP Unit, there's the Google test, and there's another one that's evading me right now, is CPP test or something. Anyway, so there are some, but they really have a number of drawbacks, especially when you're trying to test both a combination of C and C++ code. Now, this is actually this lower level of the pyramid, and with the code analysis that we talked about a moment ago, is where Parasoft's development testing tools for C, C++, Java, and .NET can help. When it comes to unit testing with JUnit, we have technology which will actually help you with creation of those tests. We're not going to talk about that today. If that's something of interest, fire a message to the chat, and we'll make sure we'll follow up with you with that. Where we are going to be focusing on today, though, is how we can actually do the test automation part, both the API testing. We're going to be using Parasoft SOA test here, and also how we can do Selenium-driven UI testing. So we're actually going to show how we can create Selenium tests that are both maintainable and scalable, and how we can tie traceability across all of these tests together back to our original user stories. Now, how we're going to do that is we're going to do that by aggregating the data into a centralized dashboard, giving you a complete view of the quality of your pipeline. So this is great. This is very useful. You're going to be able to see kind of trends. You're going to be able to see metrics, but it's lacking a connection. That connection is back to the original work item. So this is something that you're going to be missing if you just are focused on dashboards and reports. What you need is a way to be able to take that data that's been aggregated and feed it back into the original system of record, feed it back into version 1, feed it back into Jira, and be able to use that to propagate the test status so that we can get that single pane of glass view and we can get our traceability report. We also want to be able to extend the dashboard so that we can actually display all of that quality data correlated with those individual requirements. So things like code analysis, for example, I want to be able to correlate the results of my code analysis with those user stories that are being implemented. So I can get an understanding of where within my application potential security vulnerabilities live. And then lastly, I'm going to want to be able to use that data to drive my workflow, drive the creation of additional work items. So when you get a test failure within your ecosystem, that test failure doesn't actually necessarily mean the functionality it's testing is broken. Test automation is not, it's not stable. That's the thing, right? So most organizations are going to experience around about a 10% instability within their test environments. Now, there are things that you can do to reduce that number. Service virtualization is a way of doing that, where I can actually isolate my test environment from its external dependencies, and I can reduce the probability of having an outage in an external dependency affect my test automation and therefore affect the results. Now, that's kind of like a little dirty secret around test automation. So the question is, how can I take that data from failing tests and how can I build that into my process so I can efficiently identify things that need to be worked on? And this is where, again, the quality dashboard helps me with triaging the results that are coming from my test automation and bringing that back into the development workflow. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and step through three different parts of our story today. We're going to create tests for a web application. We're going to create UI tests. They're going to be pure Selenium tests. We're going to do it by recording in the UI. We're going to go to an IDE, and I'll show you that today, and I'll show you how you do the test association. We're also going to create API tests for that same scenario. And I'm going to show you how you can create API tests by just monitoring the user's interaction with the application, rather than trying to figure out and reverse engineer how the APIs are used under the hood, which is the number one challenge that folks face when they're trying to do API testing. Then lastly, I'm going to talk about the traceability back to the original story. So we're going to start with the stories, and we're going to end with the stories. Okay, so let's go ahead and step out of here. And let's actually start with our Agile Planning system. Now, I'm going to use version 1 today. We're actually going to come back and talk about Jira at the end in a second. But we're going to start with version 1. You can see here that I have a backlog. We have several stories. We actually have a couple of defects and issues within there. We'll talk about those as we go. But we can see that there's actually one story here at the bottom, at the bottom of my backlog, called Update My Profile. We're going to go ahead and we're going to create a test for updating our profile on our application. Okay, so here's our application. Our application is a bank, and we have, kind of a simple banking example. So here I can go in and I can see my accounts. Now I can also see that somebody has actually gone in and played with my test environment. So I'm going to just step off the screen and reinitialize. This is always the first thing that we do within a demo, is make sure that the environment is set up correctly. So here we go, we've got my test environment. I'm going to go ahead and just go ahead and log out now. Now, let's go ahead and create UI and API tests at the same time for this application. Now, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and here click the Parasoft recorder in Chrome. And as I said, I'm going to create UI interactions, and I'm also going to create API tests as well. Okay, and then we go start recording. Okay, so now the Chrome browser plugin is actually monitoring what I'm doing. So I'm going to go ahead and log in. Okay, we can see I've got my bank accounts. I'm going to go ahead and update my contact information. So we're just going to give our name. Let's go ahead and say Mark Lambert, and we're going to just leave the rest of it as it is. I'm going to say update profile, and then I'm going to log out. Okay, great. So I've created my test. I'm going to go ahead and say stop recording now. Now, what I want to do is to take those user interactions and convert them into some test scenarios. So the first thing I want to do is give this a name, obviously. So I'm going to go and say update user profile. Let's call it that. Description going set to Mark. Oh, I forgot to reset it afterwards. Okay, forgot to reset. I'll just make a little note for myself there. And then I can also associate this with a work item. So this is the piece where I can now actually say, this belongs to a particular work item that I was just looking at before. Now, if I go back very quickly to my interface here, you can see this is the work item number. So this is the important number. So 01564. Okay. So we're going to go B-01564. All right. I could put in a URL here as well, but actually the way that we're going to do this integration, that is actually going to be handled for me. And then I'm going to download this recording, and I'm going to pop this into my folder here called JSON. And so now I have a recording of my UI interactions. I'm also now going to create an API test using Parasoft SOA test. So that UI recording we're going to come back to in a few moments. But here I'm going to go ahead and create my test asset. Notice that the work item ID is still the same. The test name is still the same. Now what's happening is the browser is now communicating with the SOA test server, and it's actually creating a new test based upon those interactions that it had within the web browser. I'm actually just waiting for a pop-up to appear telling me that it's done its job. Okay. Let's go ahead and actually bring up SOA test. So we've got two things that we've just done. We've created a UI test, or recording the UI test. We'll use that in a few moments. But here what I've done is I've also created an API test, and I've done that, as I mentioned earlier, leveraging Parasoft SOA test. Now, unfortunately, I think Zoom stole my notification, so I don't know if that showed up on the webinar. But here we can go into my desktop, and we can see that I actually have a number of test assets here. These are SOA test API tests, so these are actually making calls to my REST backend. And what's interesting about these is they're not just individual atomic REST calls. They've actually been augmented with SOA test's machine learning algorithm, which looks for patterns and analyzes the relationships between the different API calls to build an API test scenario. So here, for example, I can see that I made a call to a service, and if I just move this around a little bit here, I made a call to the accounts service, and here I can see that I pulled out a value from that service. That value is customer ID. And then that actual same value is leveraged in my subsequent calls. So what I'm doing here is I'm analyzing the patterns and the relationships between the different API traffic, and I'm training them together into a test scenario, which gives me the ability to really unlock the potential of API testing. Now, obviously, I could do things like I could go in here and actually create a new web file, a new asset from, actually just go ahead and just call it something. I could actually create from a particular description file. So I could create from an open API Swagger document. But the challenge is often when you're trying to do API testing and you're just looking at the description file, it's a little difficult to understand how the API is used. What we've done here is we've analyzed that data to understand how the API is used. And because we associated it with my business requirement here, I'm able to cross-correlate that through my reporting system right back into the original system of record, and we'll show that in a second. Okay, but what about that UI test? So let's go ahead, and I'm actually going to bring up just a different IDE here. Whoops, that's the same one. Let's go ahead and bring this up. Okay, so this is, again, Eclipse, and what I have in here is I've plugged in the Parasoft Selenium product, and what I have is I've got a series of Selenium tests that already exist within my application. These are tests that I've actually previously created prior to today's session. You can actually see I was doing building this suite up this morning and doing that from prior recorded tests. The interesting thing about these tests, two things. First of all, they leverage what's referred to as the page object model. This is a best practice for creating tests in Selenium, which means that my pages and the objects and the actions against those pages are defined in one location. And then when I modify the tests, I only have to define in that one location because my individual test scripts are using those objects. Okay. Now, I could create a new project here from that recording that we had earlier, but what I want to do is actually want to add to that existing model. So I'm going to go ahead and say, you know what, I want to add to this particular class, and I want to add from the recording that we did just a few moments ago. And here you can see it's taken my test name and then click finish. Now what it's doing is it's creating a new test. You see here a new test appeared, update user profile. It also modified the page object to reuse those elements. And now I have a Selenium test which can be seamlessly reused for test automation. This is done purely in pure code. There's no vendor lock in here. So these tests are pure Selenium tests. Oh, looks like we've got a problem with the application there. All right, okay, that was the one that I just created. So let's just look at the other ones that ran through. Okay, those ones worked fine. Okay, I think I know what the problem is with that. Okay. Okay, so I went through my different test scenarios. Actually, I recorded the wrong URL here. So what we can do is, yeah, we're not going to try changing this in the middle of a demo. But as you can see here, I got my Selenium test that was created from that recording. But the interesting thing here, or the important thing here, should I say, is that here I've got my association back with that original work item on the page here. Now, when you're doing your web UI test, you are going to run into problems associated with the web UI changing a lot. This is where Selenium really helps you with your Selenium testing practice. So one of the things you're going to find is that as people modify the UI, or as the development team modify the UI to support a new use case, your existing test scripts are going to start failing. And really what you need is a way to efficiently remediate that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to do exactly that. I'm actually going to run against a different endpoint of my applications. I'm going to actually run against version 2 of my bank rather than version 1, which is right here. And when I run against that, I'm actually going to turn on a few of the capabilities of Parasoft Selenium. So I'm going to turn on what we refer to as self-healing. I'm also going to turn on the HTML reporting that's going to give me the ability to actually see what Selenium did when I ran those tests. So now I'm going to run through those same 4 tests. I'm actually expecting the first one to fail because I had the wrong URL embedded in that test. But then the other two, or the other three, we're going to see something interesting. So we're going to see that the web page will actually start running through my test scenarios. And because the UI has changed, so the first one was just a simple account lookup, so that one's good. Okay, here's my first one. I've got a problem here because I've got a dynamic element page coming up in my UI, and it's taking a while to load. So there was a problem there that if I just run without Selenium, I would have had a test failure. And then likewise here, I've got a new field that's appeared in the UI, which shouldn't impact my tests, but it would normally in a normal scenario. So what we did, though, is we had Selenium running. So what it's doing here is it's giving me the ability to very quickly heal the tests at runtime and then provide you feedback as to how you can modify those tests so that you're effective in your maintenance of your test automation. Now, I'm not going to go into this in great detail. We have another webinar as part of our webinar series coming up in a couple of weeks. So please kind of watch out for emails from Parasoft. They'll talk about some of the webinars that are coming up, and you'll be able to kind of we'll get into much more detail around Parasoft Selenium. But the whole point of this is that I now have tests both at the API level and at the UI level that give me the ability to be able to do that traceability and start looking at how those tests are, or how those user stories are tested. So let's go ahead and step back to my version 1 backlog. And this time, rather than looking at my update profile, because that's actually the one that doesn't have any tests against it right now, I'm actually going to go ahead and look at this withdraw and transfer. Okay, so here within version 1, what we should be seeing is we should see that I actually have a number of tests that exist within my user story, in my backlog item. And those tests are going to have different status. And you can see that a number of them are passed. There's actually one of them that's failed here. We'll dig into that in a second. These are different types of automated tests. So here I have some SOA tests. Here I have some JUnits. Let's go ahead and look at one of those JUnits. And this gives me the details associated with that test automation, describes the test. And then also, I have a link that takes me back to where the data sits behind that test automation. So this is we have the automated tests. Those tests I just showed you a few moments ago. They're executed on my environment here. It's just in the desktop. You would typically run those as part of your CI/CD pipeline. They then get aggregated into that dashboard, as I mentioned, and then that data goes into the system of record. It goes into Jira or version 1. And here, I'm able to come back into the Parasoft dashboard and see the details associated with that test. So here, this is actually a JUnit test case, which is running against that user story. So I should be able to see, if I go to my test suite at the top, I should be able to see here, right here, we've got an association with that particular user story. And the interesting thing here is it's not just the test results. That's what we were looking at, obviously, inside of the Agile Planning system. It's also here because now we're in the dashboard, we're able to start getting into things like the underlying code coverage. So I can understand not only what thing was tested, but then how it was tested and what parts of that underlying code base are exercised as part of that unit testing scenario. Now, there are other types of tests in here, though, as I mentioned. Just kind of let me get back to, let's just see if I can get that little dialog to appear. Okay, and let's just go, okay, there we go. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is actually look at a functional test from Parasoft SOA test. And again, I have the same information. Let's go ahead and bring that back so we can actually read it. I have kind of the detailed information around the test. Now, this is a failure, though, so I have the failure message. And then I can go and link back to the Parasoft reporting and analytics dashboard to see the details associated with that test failure. So here I have my test scenario. I have the individual test set that's failing. I can then go ahead and look at my traces here and even see the underlying traffic associated with that test failure. So I'm gone again from my original system of record. I'm looking at the user stories associated with the backlog item. So let's just go back to that. Here we go. I'm looking at the user stories associated with the backlog item. I can see which items have failed, and then I can go into the Test Explorer of Parasoft Reporting and Analytics dashboard to see the details associated with that test failure. Now I can actually look at more than just that individual test. So I could actually just clear this guy and maybe look at all of the tests associated with that particular test automation run against the build. Obviously, I've got 258 tests here, so maybe I want to filter out anything which is passing. So let's just look at the failures. And here I can see individual test failures, and then I can also go into all of the details associated with that. Now, so what I've got now is I've got the ability to be able to see the data in the original system of record. I can then go into the details here within the Parasoft Reporting and Analytics dashboard. But remember, this is aggregating data from across all of my development practices. So there's actually more than just the details. There's a high-level view of my application's quality. So let's just go ahead and move my UI around a little bit here. So here, I've got data correlated not just with the user stories or the work items in version 1, but I can also see trending information associated with code analysis violations. I can see test history. I can also see code coverage, as well as being able to do more advanced analysis of the changes that have happened in the underlying code base from sprint to sprint. So I can see how much of the code that was modified in a sprint has actually been tested through the use of my test automation. So this also then gives me the ability to start drilling down and doing traceability reports that associate that same quality data, but associating it with the original work items and associating both the test as well as any static analysis findings. We'll talk about that in a second. And then here you can see here's my user story of update my profile that doesn't actually have any tests associated with it. That's why we were creating the tests. Now, lastly, before we kind of turn over to Q&A, one thing that I've not talked about is specifically Jira. So we can do all of this with Jira as well. So obviously we can do our traceability, same traceability report. And in fact, in this example, what we have is not just tests associated with the different user stories, but we also have the correlation of the underlying source code with those user stories. So I can actually associate static analysis, security issues, reliability issues that were uncovered within the code base. And then I can go back to the original system of record. So let's go ahead and pick on 3. And I can see here within Jira that same type of test information. And actually, let's look at a different one than that. Let's go ahead and look at the first one. There we go. That's got a little bit more, a few more test cases associated with it. So here I've got 4 tests associated with this particular user story in Jira. Now, the thing about Jira is, though, Jira doesn't natively support the concept of test or test management. This is where you're going to need a plugin for Jira. Here we're using X-Ray as the example, and certainly X-Ray is what we use at Parasoft for our own test management process and our own integration with automation. But there are other plugins available for Jira as well, such as Qtest and Zephyr, being the other 2, which are actually very popular as well. So same theory works, though. So here, in the same way that I'm passing the test results back into, in essence, here what I have is the X-Ray plugin for Jira. The same capabilities, the same concepts would apply for doing the integration with one of those other ecosystems as well. Okay, so we're almost at the end of today's session. So let's go ahead and just kind of wrap up a little bit. Okay, so these are the 3 steps we went through today. So we actually created tests against the UI and the API, and we did both of those at the same time. So we leveraged the recorder to record the UI interactions. We used Parasoft Selenium to create these page object model tests. And then I briefly showed you how we can leverage machine learning to recover when the UI changes. Now, I didn't go into any great details. As I said, we'll be doing a webinar on that in the coming weeks. We're also going to be doing a webinar in the coming weeks around API testing and how we can leverage Parasoft SOA test to really make REST API or testing of REST APIs much, much easier. And I kind of gave you a bit of a preview with that as to how we can use the machine learning algorithms in SOA test to uncover the hidden relationships between the different REST calls. And then last but not least, the whole reason for this presentation today, talking about how we can take that test automation data and get it back into the original system of record, being able to do full traceability so that now you can immediately know what user stories have been impacted negatively by your test changes in the code base. And then hopefully what you saw as well was a little flavor of the types of analysis that we can use by aggregating data from across the testing practices and start looking at the underlying changes in the application code base. Start looking at how the tests relate with the code, using code coverage, how we can start applying continuous quality practices like deep code analysis and applying that as we go. Okay, so I do see a number of questions coming through on the chat, so I'm going to take a look at those in a few moments. So looking at the technologies we talked about today, I didn't go into any great details around JTest, C++ test, and .test. These are our development testing focused products. If you'd like some more information, we are going to cover those during our upcoming webinar series as well. JTest, obviously, for Java, not just for code analysis, but also for unit testing. C++ test the same. And then .test for .NET languages. As I move up the testing pyramid, we start talking about API testing. This is where SOA test comes in. We do firmly believe that API testing is a great way of doing effective early stage performance testing, and we'll talk about that again in a subsequent webinar. And then at the top, we're talking about Selenium. Selenium is the #1 test automation framework for web UI. It is what most people are using. It is what most people know. So Parasoft Selenium kind of plugs right into that. And then this other concept of service virtualization, I hinted on. Service virtualization gives us the ability to decouple our test automation from the test environment, or should I say, of the external dependencies of that test environment. So as I said a few times today, we are running a webinar series covering on each of these different aspects. So please look out for emails from Parasoft that are going to go through some of those. If you've got something that you would love us to go into in more detail, please reach out to us. Let us know. info@parasoft.com is a great email to kind of just throw a message into us. We also have a contact form. So with that being said, I'm going to take a quick look at questions. I'm going to go pretty quick because we only have a couple of minutes left, and I am appreciative of people's time today. So first of all, is there a way to define success or failure criteria on the tests? Yes, assertions would be the term that we use. Again, I didn't go into the details of the test creation today, but yes, in all of those cases, you can define pass-fail criteria. And in fact, I would actually argue that an automated test is actually kind of useless unless you have assertions in there. You can help from a unit testing perspective. Hey, it didn't blow up. Well, that's one thing, but really you do need assertions in there to make sure that you have a solid pass-fail criteria. And that's actually what drives a lot of those test results that you saw up there. Can I use Parasoft with C#? Yes, Parasoft.test supports C#. It's focused on the development level, so that's for deep code analysis as well as execution of unit tests. And doing the traceability of the unit tests for C#. Now, when it comes to SOA test and Selenium at the top, at the higher levels of the pyramid, when you're testing the application, it doesn't matter what the application is written in. The test automation is independent of that. Parasoft Selenium today is is focused on Java-based Selenium tests. So we are actually looking at different technologies that we want to support in subsequent phases. If you're specifically asking me a question around Selenium C#, if you could reach out to info@parasoft.com, we'll actually have the product management team respond to you and kind of probably ask you a few questions, and then we can get into a little bit more detail on that. Okay, test cases can be defined based upon input data. Yes, so the test cases, especially, this is really powerful when it comes to SOA test for API testing, is SOA test has built-in capabilities for doing data-driven tests, so providing data in Excel spreadsheets, database queries, all those great things. And you can set up not just input values, but also you can set up pass-fail criteria that way too. Same is true for unit testing. When we're talking about Selenium and Selenium testing, that's coming. So we actually have that on the roadmap for release later this year. So, but short answer to that question is yes. Okay, how do we run the same script on different browsers? So you can actually change. In essence, it's done through the use of the web driver within Selenium. We'll talk about that more in the scaling Selenium testing webinar. We actually have integrations, excuse me, with also Source Labs and Experitest C-Test products to enable kind of Selenium Grid type functionality, as well as obviously working with Selenium Grid too. Okay, I think I'm just going to look real quick. Okay, I think we were just, actually we're running a little out of time. I've seen some other questions. Is Parasoft available from a trial basis? Yes, reach out to us through info@parasoft.com, or if you go to the different product pages, there's either a try or demo buttons on the different pages. So click that, and our team will be able to kind of engage with you, kind of walk you through what you're trying to do, so we can make sure we kind of focus you on the right products and what have you. Okay, I see a question about Cypress. This is the last one I'll take. Cypress is an interesting testing framework as an alternative to Selenium, especially if you're doing JavaScript. What I'll say right now is it's still very new. When I look at the market, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the Scaling Selenium webinar in a few weeks, what we see is we do see Cypress coming up, but it's nowhere near as much as Selenium. So Selenium really is, it's been around, I forget now, it's 10, 15 years, but it's been around a long time. And Selenium is a very well mature technology that a lot of people understand how to do. Cypress is coming up, and it is something worth watching, especially if you're trying to do, as I said, JavaScript-based web UIs. But I will say that there's a lot more supporting technology out there today for Selenium. So I think that's probably the right place to focus on, in my opinion. Okay, I think I managed to cover everything. I only went over 3 minutes, so thank you everybody for staying on. Really appreciate that. This webinar has been recorded, and the slides will be available as well. So please stay tuned for more webinars over the coming weeks. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your time today. Stay safe, and see you on the next webinar.